everyone. Welcome to this special presentation. This has been the biggest question in all of the creation versus evolution war. Who can better explain the diversity of life that we see on Earth today? And which model makes the better predictions? The atheist critics have also made a challenge for young Earth creationists called the phylogeny challenge, and by other names. Basically, where do we draw the line dividing ancestry? Is there a line? How do we draw this line? And how can it refute universal common ancestry and prove creation? We answer that today. So buckle up and get ready as I try to explain it so that everyone can take this and share it with everyone they want to. Now let's jump right into this. How do we draw the line of independent ancestry separating life in the biblical model? Well, this is best explained by the Rockefeller University study done in 2018, because it explains how and why genetic diversity answers this question by using mutation rates. Since I have already tried to explain this multiple times in the past to the critics, they are unable to grasp what I mean. So it must be a failure on my part at explaining it. So this time, I'm going to try a few different approaches and different explanations. Let's begin with this. At the very beginning of creation, you have mitochondria that doesn't have any mutations in them. Then, all of a sudden, it starts collecting mutations. And now we can trace these mutations that we have today back to a point where there were no mutations. Unfortunately, we can't go all the way back to creation because there was a global flood bottleneck. So the best we can do is trace mutations back to Noah's flood. Now, to know what is related, all we have to do is look for and ask, was there any convergence during that time following this mutation rate back to the bottleneck? Like there is with cats and dogs, but in this case, when it comes to humans and primates. The answer to that is no. Therefore, humans cannot be connected to primates at any time in known history, because there is no genetic connection via convergence or overlap to prove this supposed relationship. This study has shown us that independent lines of ancestry exists. Let me try to explain it to you in a different way. Since mitochondria acts as a type of battery, I figured that an analogy using batteries will work well enough. Now, different life forms would have different types of batteries depending on where they live and how they need to function. The more similar the organism, the more similar type of battery they would need. Why would an aquatic fish have a more similar battery to a dog or a cat than it would to other aquatic organisms? Well, it wouldn't and it shouldn't. And guess what? It doesn't. Now let's zoom in. Take a human and a primate. Both were created independently, but they have very similar batteries, since each were created to live in a very similar environment, eat the same type of things, and both have a similar physical body plan and layout. That should be expected if young Earth creation were true, and this was predicted beforehand. This was not predicted by evolution. Now, here is where this analogy explains how we know nothing ties us to primates, and how even other primates do not converge with one another. Each battery drains its life at a little bit different rate, but not by much. The real difference comes down to different generational times. So a human would have less mutations than a chimp, but not because the human is a newer species like evolution presumes, but rather because humans have a higher generation time. Science has now confirmed that both humans and chimps both came out of the exact same bottleneck at the same time. This explanation is the only choice we have for what we see when we look for relation. So we can therefore look at how low the battery is today in each species and then take that back to a point when it was a full charge. This would be the global bottleneck. It is at this point where we find both chimps and humans have a full battery charge in the very recent past. Now in my analogy, the battery is getting lower over time, but this, in reality, is in the form of mutations, and the battery is the mitochondria. The question arises, Does this mean that going back to this bottleneck that the batteries are now identical between chimps, gorillas, pongo, and humans? In other words, no mutations and identical mitochondria? No. And that, my friends, is why there are independent lines of ancestry. Humans, Denisovan, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Erectus could not have, and did not, split from apes. We would need genetic evidence of divergence coming from a split to confirm this idea, and we just don't see it. All we see is that all humans, and all the different species of gorillas, and all the different species of chimps, and all the different species of pongo, all go back to a single bottleneck, which they all came out of together as a single species. This is called the isopoint, and tracing all these species back takes us directly to a single ancestor species that gave rise to each and all of the related species of that creature that we see today. Exactly what the biblical story of Noah tells us happened. If you were to zoom in on the originally created battery placed in a human, it would be a different built-in code than it would be in a primate. Why? Because these areas that are without mutation all have beneficial functions, just like today. Mutations change the original function, and unfortunately the vast majority are for the worse. So the similarities and the differences that we see should be expected because the same programmer designed all life. What is causing these new changes are mutations, and we can use these mutations to trace back to a point in history to see what is related and if we converge with any other species. Or is there evidence for independent ancestry with clearly created design diversity built in, where mutations that arise cause problems? That is the real question of ancestry, and a paternity test has not, nor ever will, show us that we are related to a primate of any kind, because we are not, and it can't. So mutation rates help us explain this entire scenario and the pattern that we see. So the question of, can evolution or creation better explain the diversity of life we see today? Well, that question is no longer on the table, as young Earth creation answers it way better. And since all life is essentially the same age genetically, then there is only one explanation for all of these things we see. Between fast mutation rates with few total mutations, few fixed substitutions with fast substitution rates, with no mitochondrial mutation saturation in anything alive, and a single paternal line leading right back to Noah in the recent past, and a single maternal line leading all the way back to Eve at creation. There is no other explanation than the biblical model of ancestry to explain what we see. Now let me break down the evolutionary tree of life real quick. They tell us all life evolved from bacteria billions of years ago. Well, bacteria have as low as 1,500 genes. So over time, they supposedly evolved more genes and eventually became different organisms that we see in the world today over long periods of time. Along the way, as they produced these new organisms that eventually became a common ancestor to a new evolutionary line of species, this is a convergence point. After that, this new line diverges from that common ancestor. This is the idea of how evolution works and why all things are related. So over time, something will spawn that is a new parent species, and all new species from it will get more genetically distant from it. And over time, they will become less genetically similar to one another. Because of this way of thinking, Harvard's leading evolutionary theorist, Ernest Mayr, predicted that finding similar DNA differences between very diverse organisms would be futile. He claimed that random genetic changes over millions of years explained the differences in creatures' traits, and that those many changes would have obviously obliterated genetic similarities. And he would be correct if evolution was true. But then we go to the biblical model, and in 1975, prior to any detailed genetic analysis, the Institute for Creation Research founder, Dr. Henry Morse, asserted that there would be a common underlying design pattern to explain similar structures. He said, "The creative process would have designed similar structures for similar functions and different structures for different functions. In the creation model, the same similarities are predicted on the basis of a common purpose designer. What do we see? Taxonomically restrictive orphan genes, species-specific endogenous retroviruses, extremely high genetic similarity between all life. Now remember, evolution predicted the exact opposite. We find what young Earth creation predicted the entire time. This is why evolution had to invent a genetic bottleneck as a rescue device for their falsified prediction. Yet, to this very day, they still have zero evidence for this mythical bottleneck that they have to invoke 200,000 years ago in their very own fossil record that they created. So imagine the problem that they have. So evolutionist Ernest Mayr was correct in his assumption because deep time evolution is not true. And this is where they were forced to conclude that a global bottleneck had to be true. It was a retrodiction made after the fact. And now look, they try to use this genetic similarity as the best evidence for evolution when it was a falsification of evolution. And even though they hate the idea of a biblical catastrophic event killing off 90% of all life on Earth, they are forced to invoke it anyway, because there is such low diversity in all life today. How could that be the case if deep time is true? It cannot. Therefore, a global bottleneck genetic reset in all life was a rescue device that they had to use, but was written about in Scripture long before. The Bible told us to expect to find a global bottleneck because of Noah's flood, and it ended up being 100% true. And I think the funniest part about all of this is now they have to invoke a global bottleneck, and this is what our model has said all along. Now, let's go back to the evolutionary tree of lies. Let's take a primate species as an example. If these were the first of the species, and they had offspring, let's say over 2,000 years, then, for sake of argument, let's assume there are multiple speciation events over that 2,000 years. Let's say 3 new species now exist. Then a bottleneck happens. Well, who survives? Which species makes it? Let's say a single species from line 3. So now we have a single species from the primate family who has incurred loss of genetic diversity from its beginning, as it is the last species to arise after creation. It now goes into a new bottleneck, and now it is the parent ancestor for all new species that arrive after this point. So now, all mutations in all future generations can now be tracked back to this, and only this, most recent common ancestor. No further back in time. Unless, of course, there were other species in that family that survived the bottleneck. And we just don't see this in the data. So when people say, oh, we have a shared most recent common ancestor with a missing link primate 7 million years ago, well, they can say that all they want, but there is no genetic evidence for this whatsoever. It would be impossible to obtain the data, even if we wanted it to be true, because even according to them, multiple bottlenecks have occurred since that time. And now that you know, since we can only go back to the last most recent bottleneck and no further, we definitely know that we can't trace back past multiple bottlenecks. And what do we see in genetics? Well, we only see individual lines of ancestry, all dividing animal species into the groupings that we would expect to see as young Earth creationists. Individual lines of ancestry. Humans, chimps, gorillas, pongo, and baboons all have their individual branches of ancestry that all their related species can be traced back to this bottleneck. And why do we see this? Well, Scripture tells us because Noah only took one species of each of these kinds on the ark with him, and that is exactly what we see in the genetics. No tree of life, no universal common ancestor, not even different lines of ancestry within these different apes. Think about it. Even if there had been only 2 different primate species from the same lineage, we would see that, but we don't. Yet we do see this when we look at humans. Why? Because Noah's son's 3 wives had different mitochondria, so we can trace back further. But we can't do that when looking at the male Y chromosome lineage. Why? Because Noah's Y chromosome was the only lineage left on Earth, so we can trace his mutation rate right back to him 4,500 years ago. While these ape species, they can be traced back to a single common ancestor of their own family which survived this bottleneck, which just so happened to kill off every single one of their related species, exactly what the Bible describes. It's impossible for this evolutionary phylogenetic chart to be true, because now we know that all life went into a bottleneck recently. Therefore, how could any species be older than another one? It can't. They all have to be the same age. This is a case-closed argument. The reason the Tree of Life chart connecting Ancestry was made is that they have to assume genetic similarities evolved over time to be similar and then diverge. Thus, the oldest species in the family with the most genetic similarity, according to them, is the one with the most mutations. But this fails because, as I stated earlier, the only explanation that there is now is that all individual primates and humans are the same age. Therefore, different generation times are what caused more mutations to build up, making it appear as though one primate family diverged from the other because one is older than the other. But this is easily solved by simply looking at generation times. Now, look at the door in the background. That door represents the bottleneck. Everything that walked through it survived. This means they were all the same age. So why do we see charts like this one, with the pongo, then the gorilla, then the chimpanzee, and then eventually human, showing the evolutionary pattern of life? Well, as I said, this was made based on assumptions that more mutation means it's older. That's all. So, why is a panda bear evolutionarily older than a brown bear according to evolution? Mutations. They have more of them. Since they believe that all bears mutate at the same rate, then more mutations mean an older bear. The truth? Panda bears have the lowest generation time of all bears, almost 3 times lower than the average. So obviously, they have more than twice as many generations than the average bear species since the last bottleneck. So of course they would have more mutations, and of course it would make them appear to be evolutionarily older, but it doesn't necessarily make them any older than any other bear species. And now you know why. This exact problem is what we have with the out of Africa hypothesis, but that's another topic for another time. So you might be asking, why do humans have so few mutations? Well, since humans have the highest generation time, we have the least amount of mutational differences because there have been fewer generations, while the pongo has the lowest generation time, so they have far more mutations in them because they have had more generations that have passed since the bottleneck. This has led scientists to misconstrue them as being older. It's the paradigm driving the conclusion. They've been looking for any type of evidence they can to tie man to the pongo, all because of Charles Lyell, who eventually passed the idea on to Darwin. Evolution theory believes in neutral theory, which is the idea that everything mutates at the same rate. But this should be a dead concept by now, because we know that even other humans don't mutate at the same rate as others do, let alone other animal species.
So I ask creationists often, where does inheritance of genetics stop working? Right? You accept that paternity tests work. You accept comparative genomics to say that lions and tigers are related, right? Lions and tigers are 95% similar on their coding base pairs. Humans and chimps, 3.8 times more than that. So why does it break down for you there? And they never have an answer. I've never heard a convincing answer for that.
So it went from I've never heard an answer to I've never heard a convincing answer. What she meant to say was I've never heard an answer that I've understood or liked. That's more like it. Because we've all had conversations with this person, and the genetics completely goes over her head.
Yeah, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm not a geneticist.
Again, I'm not a geneticist. I can't say for certain genetics is not my forefront.
Because I'm not a geneticist.
As I've said for like the 20th time, I'm not very well versed in genetics. I can't give you great answers because I don't know them.
So going back in time, in the human lineage, we converge on a single human ancestor with nearly identical mitochondria, especially when we look in a single gene in the mitochondria called the CO1 gene, which is one of the fastest mutating genes in all of the mitochondria. Therefore, it is the best gene to test ancestry. When we do this in all the different chimpanzee species alive today, we also go back in time and converge on a single chimpanzee ancestor of all living species. Their mitochondria today are a lot more mutated than ours. But even going back to the bottleneck, it's still different than ours was back then, showing separate ancestry. These differences can only be explained by having independent lines of ancestry that went into a bottleneck and came out the other side. If it was true that we shared a common ancestor with any other primate species like evolution claims, then we could find evidence for that in our genetics, and we simply do not show that. This has been confirmed by the 2018 Rockefeller University study, and this is what was so surprising to them, and again, a prediction not made by evolution. Only young Earth creation. To prove common ancestry, we need to see a convergence going into the past, and we don't. So if there was ever a split, then we would see it by removing mutations in both humans and chimpanzees, going back in time to having identical matching mitochondria. We do not see that going back in time. We see individual lineages. Because we don't see that, they had to resort to a rescue device and say, well, this split was before that last bottleneck. That's why we don't see it. Well, now they've just admitted they cannot prove genetic relation to a common ancestor in the past and must resort to storytelling because they have just tossed out the observable evidence. What we see are independent lines of ancestry only. And sure, they can say whatever they want about convergence in the past, but they can never prove it observationally. What we do see and can prove is separate ancestry. Therefore, all cat species and breeds should have the same mtDNA tracing back mutations that would land on a single common ancestor, and that is exactly what we see in all lineages. So yes, we see it in humans, and yes, we see it in chimps, and yes, we see it in gorilla. And this goes down the line. Bears, dogs, wolves. Now if you really want to get into the details, then hold on. Because all we have to do is look at genetic similarity at the time when the bottleneck occurred. What would we expect to see if 7 million years had really passed between a split between humans and primates, with what we know about the mutation rate and how fast it is? Well, evolution has a huge problem, because we see far too few differences over a 7 million year old time frame. Think about it like this. Mutations are arising over 4,500 years. This has caused around 65 mutations on average in all of the chimpanzee species alive today. This is looking in the CO1 gene. And though evolutionists agree with these numbers, they reject the fast observable mutation rate for the assumed bottleneck 200,000 years ago, even without any physical evidence. They just invent their own mutation rate called the phylogenetic rate. Okay, fine. Let's say that that is true. This is easy to put to the test and show how easily it is to refute deep time evolution common ancestry. Now let's go back in time 7 million years. Okay, now we have a common ancestor with its mitochondrial DNA, especially in the CO1 gene, with no mutations. Now the human line starts. Then we have all the different chimpanzee species. So if over 200,000 years have passed and chimpanzees have around 65 mutations in their CO1 gene, how many would 7 million years have accumulated? Well, the math is easy. Let's help evolution and say with only 50 mutations on average every 200,000 years, then over 7 million years we have 1,750 mutations that would have built up just in the chimpanzee line to separate the ancestry commonality between humans and them. But here's the thing. How many mutations can the CO1 gene hold before it fills up? Well, the CO1 gene is 650 base pairs long. The entire mitochondria itself is 16,569, and it can tolerate up to 12,000 mutations for saturation. The same rule applies to the CO1 gene. That's a 75% saturation point before equilibrium. Therefore, we would land on finding 487 mutations in the CO1 gene before this saturation point is reached. Is this what we see when we look inside this gene? Not at all, as you can see. We were all created very similar, but with subtle differences, and not a lot of time has passed since then to make us very different. If deep time was true, genetic similarity would be exactly what evolution predicted, and we would have little to no similarity at all, especially with how fast the mutation rate is. We should either see an identical match, going back to convergence, which is going back to the bottleneck if they wanted to prove common ancestry, or we should be extremely different than chimpanzees if deep time were true. We don't see either one. Evolution tries to say that this CO1 gene mutation rate is actually slow, only 1% every million years. But this slow rate of change is based on the fossil record, as I stated earlier, and this is easily refuted when we look at how many mutations are in human beings today. Modern-day humans range anywhere from 0 to 10. Now, who has the 10? It's the Africans that have the most diversity. This is where the out of Africa idea even comes from. So therefore, since African people haven't existed until about 200,000 years ago, according to the evolutionary theory, where they emerged out of this last bottleneck, then there is no possible way that the 10 max mutations that we do have did not arise at any other time than after this last bottleneck time period. So whether or not you want to believe this was 200,000 years ago time frame or just 4,500 or so, it doesn't even matter, because either way, it's just too fast of a mutation rate for evolution to have so few differences between humans and chimps, either way you look at it. So even if we're going with the slowest evolutionary mutation rate, and we find 10 mutations arising in 200,000 years, then it's impossible for evolution to try to explain the few differences there are between humans and chimpanzees over 7 million years. The differences between us and them would be in the hundreds. Yet we only find there is around 65 to 75 differences. So what model best explains these differences? The young Earth creation model, where God created and designed genes to function similarly in similar created kinds. And from creation till the bottleneck, mutations had arisen, causing diversity within the species. Then we have a single lineage going into a bottleneck and coming out the other side, and that is exactly what the genetic evidence tells us, even in their very own evolutionary literature. But where does Neanderthal fit into all of this? We realize that they said Neanderthals and Denisovan are much older than us because they have more mutations, right? Well, let's go to the CO1 gene yet again. Looking at Neanderthals, we find 18 mutations there maximum, and Denisovan 20. But this is not really all that high, considering they lived in small populations of around 20 people and were isolated and inbreeding people for around 800 years. This actually falls perfectly into what our model says and should expect to find in them. Why would we say that? Well, look at chimpanzees. They're the perfect example of this, since they never went extinct, and today they have around 65 to 75 mutations on average. So everything in our model lines up perfectly. They were mutating at the same rate. So it's easy. If you had tested a chimpanzee 800 years after the flood, they would have been mutating at almost the exact same rate as the people we call Neanderthal, which would have had around 15 to 20 mutations at that point. We know that Denisovan, Neanderthal, and modern-day man all met one another and interacted. Therefore, that immediately rules out interacting with them before a bottleneck, because, according to evolution, modern humans didn't even exist to interact with. Therefore, we have the smoking gun refuting evolution, and that all of these people were just living together at the same time, and mutation rates show us that there is no possible way that they could have lived before the bottleneck, since they were all on the same side of the bottleneck together, and mutations all line up and take us right back to the same bottleneck together. Now we know that the high amount of mutation accumulation that we see in us and them had to all take place after the bottleneck. And this fits perfectly with what we've been saying all along, based on what we know about isolation, divergence, and population size. So the genetic boundary already existed at the bottleneck. It is the boundary of the genetic differences that separate different kinds. This boundary cannot be bridged by just assuming common ancestry is true and using imagination to bridge these gaps and go back in time before a bottleneck. Then presume something that we've never seen happen today happened back then, such as a common ancestor splitting into different animal families. Believing a split between humans and chimps happened is fine, but it's faith-based and without evidence. As I stated earlier, that if it were true, there would be far more differences if this split actually happened in the deep past. We just don't see that. Nor do we see this convergence in the deep past with any of these so-called splits. Take Miacids, for example, which supposedly split into dogs, bears, cats, mongoose, skunks, otters, badgers, raccoons, hyenas, weasels, polecats, and even aquatic walruses and seals. The genetic convergence doesn't exist for any of these. There is no evidence for it, and there never will be. Do not be deceived. So again, even if this evolutionary scenario of common ancestry was true, there would be no way of proving it, since there is no possible way to connect ancestry to anything past a bottleneck event. And even they were forced to admit that a global bottleneck genetic reset had to have occurred. So they are stuck ever being able to prove common ancestry because of it. So they had to save their dying theory by invoking something else that also destroys their theory. That's evolution for you. So, what has genetic testing using DNA barcoding exposed in the last 5 years? Well, it has validated the young Earth creation position of independent lines of ancestry with genetic boundaries that should not exist if evolution was true. It also confirms scripture, which states that a global bottleneck happened, even killing the aquatic life on Earth. Evolution never predicted this, and originally stated it did not happen. When the undeniable genetic evidence finally confirmed that it did, they went looking in their own made-up fossil record created by an atheist with an agenda, and they found nothing. The absence of transitional fossils that should be everywhere in the fossil record, if it was true, is another telltale sign that the story is another myth based on imagination and lies. We see fast mutation rates, low genetic diversity, independent lines of ancestry with genetic boundaries, and biological evidence of a global bottleneck inside of all life on Earth. All of this only points to one conclusion: the young Earth creation biblical model of ancestry. There's no way around it. So the case for independent origins versus common ancestry is really a dead issue. The sad part is that people think evolution is science, and it's not. It's anti-science, because it doesn't allow competing theories. It is also unfalsifiable. It also doesn't make predictions, even on mutations which the theory is based on. And it can't even predict what anything is going to evolve into because the theory is so plastic that they will just say, well, anything can happen. The only reason it hangs on is because it's protected by law. It's sad that kids will only hear one side of a horrible argument, the side that is nothing but a made-up lie invented for an agenda, that tells them that they are related to the very strawberry that they are eating for lunch. Imagine that.
There's a reason intelligent design isn't taught in our learning institutions. The legal staff of Freedom from Religion Foundation, a church-state watchdog group, has had remarkable success in convincing many institutions, such as school boards and town councils, that they are breaking constitutional law when they sponsor sectarian activities. That includes intelligent design. When the authorities can't be convinced, Freedom from Religion Foundation sues, and it wins more often than not.
If you want your kids to learn real science and want to get young Earth creation taught at your local school, then look no further than Curriculum in Crisis. My book was created for one reason and one reason only: to get your local public school to teach a better model than evolution, one that better explains the genetic diversity of life we see on Earth today. This book will teach you how and why it's so important to get biblical creation into your local public schools so kids do not grow up believing a lie that ruins their minds forever.
There is no disputing the fact that there's one single Y chromosome ancestor and one mitochondrial DNA ancestor. This is exactly what the Bible has predicted.
As a quick reminder to everyone, hit that like button. It actually does help. Team Standing for Truth is out.